Hello, everybody. This is the questions, the Q&A that I did at a women's conference back in February. We wanted to make sure that we could get some real life questions about some pretty personal things without exposing people. So we did not record social media at the time, but we did record my media so that I could get you guys the answers that I said. And so I'm very grateful for my team. It took us a little while to be able to get all the questions and make sure that I got all the answers like they were in real time. So we're going to give you guys the questions and I'm going to give you guys the answers. Okay, so question number one was someone saying, you've talked a lot about your real life experience and your testimony and kind of the trauma that you went through, but I don't know what that trauma is. Can you please tell me what that trauma is? So my response was, I think the story that was big for my life, like the real thing that was a trauma is in my life, I grew up, everything that happened seemed very small, but there was so much of it that it actually like interfered with my childhood. And so when it came to remembering my childhood, I really didn't have a lot of memories. So when I went through this time period and God started to expose some of these things, the things that I remembered is, when I was 5, I was molested by one of my friends who was like 2 or 3 years older than me. And to me, it wasn't a big deal, right? Like, hey, this is just a neighborhood girl who was experimenting. It was just one of those things that you shoved down and you didn't talk about. And because it didn't get talked about, I didn't ever get to deal with the consequences of that little girl taking away my innocence at the age of 5 and having to kind of deal with things that a 5-year-old shouldn't have to deal with and the consequences of what that brought through the rest of my life. Also, when I was 5 years old, my friend's brother threw me up against the wall and it was a very scary situation. And I also had an incident where I was treated very badly by a babysitter. And so all this happened when I was younger, and so it affected the way that I perceived like safety and protection as I grew up. And because of that, I made choices trying to protect myself, but those were not the way that I should have. Like I was stuck as like a 5-year-old in a sense. And because of that, like I just felt like with that and then not feeling like I had a lot of emotional maturity and didn't have maybe a lot of that in the home because we were all kind of dealing with some of our stuff. I kind of led to a point where I became very suicidal at the age of 11. And then that continued. And suicide became self-harm, which then became alcoholism and pill popping and being a little bit more lustful and being kind of loose with men and things like that. And so it kind of followed me through my childhood into my adulthood. And I think the biggest thing for me was struggling with the suicide, thinking like, this is all my fault. Like I had this perfect childhood and I had these great parents and all these things, but yet I was still very stuck in this very suicidal tendency. And because of that, it brought a lot of shame and it brought a lot of guilt. And I didn't really know how to connect with people because of that. And so it really affected like my ability even in adulthood. So that's kind of my testimony and where I was at, having to deal with these things that seem very small were actually repetitive over time, were very big and really affected the way that I received things and the way that I did things growing up. So that's kind of my story. Okay, so the second question is, what was the jumping off point that got you to your healing? So I think the jumping off point really for me was just like fighting for 2 years and just being really, really exhausted. And when you've been fighting for 2 years, like you just get to a point that you're like, I can't do this anymore. Something has to change. And, I joke, but this is a real story. Like there was this day that I was just really angry and I got on the ground and like a 5-year-old, I was slamming and like tantruming on the ground. And like, I literally looked like a 5-year-old. I was screaming at God and I was just pounding my fist. And at that point, my heater failed. Like it just like turned off and it got really cold. It was a cold day. And I was just like, are you kidding me, God? Like, you're going to throw all of this on top of me? Like, I already am dealing with all this stuff. And God's like, hey, girl, at least I didn't break your hip. And, I love that our Father can be very funny and genuine with that, but it was true. There was a point in which it was like I was fighting him so hard. It was like Jacob trying to get his promise. And God's like, I'm gonna give you a warning before I break your hip. And I just love that about God. And we're going back to what we were talking about earlier when we were really talking about David Jonathan, but we were also talking about Ziba, and we were talking about Mephibosheth. And I think it's so in this entire story, there's so much symbolism that happens in this story. And one of the biggest things that I think sometimes we forget or we don't see is that Ziba was Saul's servant. And Ziba, at the end of the day, acts like a servant. He acts like a slave. And he gets the promise from David by lying and manipulating and not telling the truth. And because he didn't really care about the relationship with David, he cared about getting the promise or getting the wealth, getting the field and the things that he stole basically from Mephibosheth by lying about what Mephibosheth had done. Whereas Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son, and he acted like a son. And at the end of the day, he says, the very last thing we hear him say is, I don't care about the land or about all the riches and the goods. I just care that you're home. I just care, David, about your relationship and that you're here with me again. And I feel like that is the jumping off point for me, was that I was living like a slave and I was acting like a servant, demanding for a promise through manipulation and slavery, when God had created me to be a daughter, and going through that sonship or that daughtership, and knowing my worth through that. And I think once I realized that was really the jumping off and the biggest part of my healing. Okay, so the third question, how did you go about overcoming your addiction? So I was really kind of struggling with two addictions, but I did go to CR about 3 or 4 years ago to overcome my alcoholism. I never really identified that though as my true addiction. Once I went to CR and I did the 12 steps and I went through the program and I worked the program, I realized that alcoholism was just covering my true addiction, which was suicide. And I know people kind of look at you is suicide really an addiction? And the truth of it is yes, because I kind of always had this out. God, if you are not who you say you are, if you are not as good as I think you are, or if you don't give me your promise, well, then I have a way out. I can say, I'm done and I'm going to commit suicide. And then that was my demand. And honestly, it was kind of like I was manipulating and kind of controlling God. So that to me was my real addiction. And so I thought that I had really conquered that about 13 years ago. And when it came back, I was really surprised because I thought I'd overcome it. And I feel like there was nothing worse. I think that was one of the hardest things for me to accept is here I am, 35 years old. I'm a leader of the intercessor team. I'm a physical therapist. I'm a pillar in the community, and a lot of people knew who I was. And here I am still struggling with suicide. And I felt like I was stuck. And then being really, it was I was in a day, every day I was kind of afraid of my circumstances. And what was going to come up this day that was it going to mean that I was going to try to kill myself because of this day, or what the circumstance was going to bring? What really broke it for me is that at this point in time, I was asked to step down from the intercessor team as a leader because I was struggling with some of this stuff and I really needed to see God for who he really was. What really snapped me out of this cycle is when God took everything away. He took away my ability to be an intercessor team leader. He let me go back to Egypt. And so he let me go back there, and I went back there and I realized that God was good, because walking in the wilderness is tough. But if you don't walk through the wilderness, you never get to the promised land. So I kept telling God I wanted to go back to Egypt because Egypt felt more comfortable. But the truth is, I was with God and he was giving me miracles and he was walking me through the wilderness. So when I said, that's it, I don't want to do this anymore, God in his grace and his love said, fine. And I was back in Egypt, and it was miserable because God wasn't there. And because that's what I chose, and that is literally honestly what did it. When I went back to Egypt and I thought I could go back to where I was and be okay, but I couldn't because I was in the absence of my king. I was miserable. And I decided that my life was worth fighting for. And he kept speaking that over me until I believed it. And I just had to believe it a little bit every day. I had to start small. I had to start small with scripture. I had to start small with decrees and declarations. I had to start small with crafted prayers and spending time with God. Those are and having God dates. But it was really when I went back to Egypt and I saw how miserable I was that I decided it was time to go and walk through the wilderness with my choice to get back to the promised land. So I believe the question, from what I can piece from the audio and my answer is, so I believe she's asking me here in this question, in my healing journey, if I had maybe some memories or some moments where I got stuck in my trauma and like how I processed through that. That's what I believe that she's asking from what I remember and how I answered. So what I would have to say with that, right, is like there were these moments that I would get very stuck. And I had done some research and I'd done some counseling. And one of the things that they would say is like, close your eyes in this moment and kind of go back to the trauma, not to where you're reliving that trauma, but where you're remembering that trauma. And you close your eyes and you ask Jesus where he was in the room. And then you look for him in the room. And you see who he is in that room. And he usually has an expression or he's speaking or something like that. And what would happen is in these moments, I would see him. And he would show me that he's always redeeming and he's always repairing. But there needs to be a point that you need to decide that you are not a victim anymore. And I think that you do have to, it's like in the story with Mephibosheth. He had to go back to his trauma, but then he saw him, like he had to go back to his trauma, but then he saw David as king in that. And he let his king repair and redeem him. I literally wrote a poem in my book, Into His Glorious Light, where I talk about you can choose to live in your trauma and like God's going to meet us there. But eventually it's my choice to decide if I want to move forward. Like that, I know that God is already redeemed and he's already repaired. And I have to believe that when he says, I was here in this moment, I fixed this trauma. I call you daughter, I call you friend, I call you beautiful. God told me, he said, I call you life. I call you light. I call you glory. And when he spoke these words over me, I literally have what I call a prayer binder. And I have in there these things that God says about me. So when the enemy or my trauma tries to come in, I can just open my binder and I can read what God has said, like an identity statement. But it can reopen our emotions, and it's hard sometimes to cope with these things. And so it's very important for us to ask God, like, who am I? Who am I? Like, how do you see me? And so if you've never done that, I really encourage you to write down what God says about you, and then know that. And your identity is what separates you from being that victim and stuck in that trauma to a victor, and to being that daughter, and to let God be that redeemer, and to be that repairer. When you know what God says about you and you choose to believe it, the enemy has no hold on you. And so you really need to know what your identity is, and you need to stand firm in that. And so there's really like these moments where you can let your trauma define you, or you can let your king define you. You can let God define you, but you have to know what that is. You have to know what God is saying about you. And so if you're feeling stuck, like I do recommend that you ask God who you are in him, how he sees you. And then if you're really stuck, close your eyes and ask God to show you where he was in that moment, and let him redeem and repair that. Okay, in this part, we actually had someone that had my book stand up and read a part of the book in one of the poems. And it was a very beautiful moment, the way that she stepped in and read it. It was the perfect thing for the moment. But this is what she said from your book. And of course, this is where this becomes very clear. God, you told me to be honest with you, and you would be honest with me. To tell you the truth, I'm so tired of hiding. Here is my heart that bleeds as I pour out these fears that lie deep inside of me. God, why do you love me? I feel like a mess trying to die to my flesh. One day I'm feeling blessed and know exactly who you say I am. Then the next I'm lost, still trying to count the cost that you have already paid. And then I kind of just talk about, after that, kind of just add to that by saying, yes, that what I love about the book is this was a period of time in which I was really struggling, and I had a really hard time talking to God. And so the book was me opening up and writing poems to God just so that I could hear him, just so I could have conversation with him, just so I could listen to him. And it was an opportunity, like when I couldn't hear, this is how he allowed me to hear. And he always met me there. And so one of the questions that's in my battle binder was, what is your favorite attribute about God? Like, what do you know that God will always do? And for me, it's always been that he's going to show up. It doesn't matter if I am angry at him, or it doesn't matter if I'm hurt and I'm literally actively sinning. He always shows up. And because he always saw me for who I was going to be, he always knew who I was going to become. Not who I was when I was going through this mess. I was pretty broken. I was pretty messed up. I had a lot of pain and I had a lot of trauma, and I hid for a lot of years. And even my parents didn't know what was going on, and they were really surprised. And I think that was what was the most hurtful for them in this journey, is that they couldn't see the pain that I was going through. In fact, I couldn't see it. Like, I hid it from myself. And but what God is using this for is to say, like, I'm still redeemable. You're still redeemable. And not only are we redeemable, we are beautifully broken. And beautifully broken is where God puts us back together to make us his masterpiece. And beautifully broken creates desperation. And when we're desperate for God, we walk with him. And we walk with him. We walk in relationship. And this is where we find freedom. So yeah, maybe today you're feeling beautifully broken. Or maybe you're just feeling broken. But that's where we start. That's how you start. Yeah, you can go to your Father and you can say, God, put me back together, because I want to be beautifully broken so you can make me into your masterpiece. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. And, this is really where my heart and my passion is, to have these conversations about real talk, real questions, being able to get real intimate. It's not always the easiest thing for me to do, to put all that out here for you guys, but I do it because there's so much healing and bringing light and truth to these areas that maybe people don't want to talk about. And so we are going to have another Q&A coming up where you guys, the viewers, get to ask me some questions. I've already gotten 3 really good questions, but I decided to hold off on answering some of those for right now until we get a few more questions, and also just making sure that my heart was in a place that I could be completely vulnerable to you guys, because that's what this is about. This is being honest and real, and bringing light to darkness, right? Like these places that we've been keeping hidden. So I'm very grateful for all the women that asked these questions, that were brave enough to stand up and ask me these questions. Women that came to me afterwards to share some of their stories and how just talking about this has helped them. And so thank you so much. And please, guys, on the comments below, make sure that you're leaving comments and liking, and subscribe to our YouTube, because we have some really good videos there that go into some pretty deep stuff. And for me, this is all about getting the message out there, to have a place that people can talk about some of these deeper issues and feel safe and know that they're not alone. So please please subscribe, please go to our YouTube, please ask questions. I'd love to do another Q&A. The first 3 questions we have are really good, and I'm really excited. So any questions that you guys may have, I would love to be open and honest about that, about the book, the process of becoming an author, even the process of waiting for your promise, and your book is out there for everyone. There's a lot that we can discuss. So thank you for being a part of my community. Thank you for following me. Thank you for going to my events, and thank you for liking my Facebooks and being involved with me. I really appreciate it, and I really can't wait to see what this is going to turn into and what God's going to bring it to. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I can't wait to hear your questions. And